Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Sinders, a postdoctoral fellow with the ICO, and I'm extremely excited to be moderating this panel with some of my personal favorite researchers and experts in this topic of deceptive design, sometimes commonly referred to as dark patterns. We have Colin Gray, Harry Brignull, Kat Zhou, and Cristiana Santos. Would y'all like to introduce yourselves really briefly? We can start with Kat.
Hi everyone, my name is Kat Zhou, pronouns she, her, and I'm the creator of the Design Ethically project, which started out as a framework for applying ethics to the design process and now has grown into a toolkit of speculative activities for teams to help forecast the consequences of their products. And with this project, I've been able to, meet folks like the wonderful people on this panel and talk in front of the EU Parliament and Federal Trade Commission about deceptive designs and these nefarious patterns.
Thank you so much, Kat. I'm such a big fan of that project. Colin, would you like to introduce yourself?
As a designer.
Oh, hey, Colin, I think your volume is low.
Come back to me, please.
Great, awesome. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to you. Harry, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Harry. In 2010, I coined the term dark patterns, so I prefer to call them deceptive patterns now. But I started the website darkpatterns.org and set up a Hall of Shame that I've been running ever since. And I think sort of it's served a function in sort of generating a lot of interest into this area. Yeah, so that's me. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Harry. I'm also a very big fan of your work, and I love the Hall of Shame. Cristiana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, nice to meet you all. So I'm Cristiana, I'm a legal scholar working at Utrecht University, where I'm assistant professor. So I've been studying deceptive design or dark patterns from a data protection perspective, assessing the lawfulness of certain practices on the UI, on the text of mostly consent requests and subject access rights. And I'm also researching the harms caused by dark patterns and how can they be measured. And of course, dark patterns cannot be studied only from a legal perspective. So I have the privilege to work with the HCI researchers like Colin, but also from a more technical perspective. And I work and collaborate with computer scientists like Natalia Bielova and others. And that's me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. Some of your papers have been extremely foundational and formative in my thinking on deceptive design and data protection. And so has Colin's work. So Colin, would you like to sort of round us out with your introduction, for the panel?
Yes, absolutely. Hopefully my audio is coming through a little bit clearer now. My name is Colin Gray, pronouns he, they, and I've been a practicing designer for a couple of decades and a social scientist, particularly focusing on dark patterns and design ethics over the last 8 years or so. I got to build on Harry's early work in the space and increasingly am working across the gamut of perspectives like Cristiana mentioned, increasingly at the intersection of design, HCI, and law. And so I'm excited to see how this plays out with the panel today. Thanks so much, Caroline.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of y'all. So I'm just going to kick off the first question, which is a bit of a combined question, one we've sort of touched on already. The term itself, dark patterns, can be quite problematic. Changing the name can be difficult. It's used in regulation across the globe. Deceptive design patterns and or dark patterns are also new terms for people. I'm curious all of your thoughts on the name. What should we call this sort of problematic space of design? Harry, you use deceptive design patterns. Kat, you refer to them as anti-patterns. And then one of the things I'm also curious about is how do we even start to define what is or isn't a deceptive design pattern / dark pattern? Harry, I think, would you like to jump in as the creator of the term and perhaps the discoverer of this area?
Yeah, so I mean, well, they're design tricks and traps in websites and apps. I just wrote that down. I thought it was good because it rhymes. So yeah, I mean, today I use the term deceptive patterns instead of dark patterns because it's more inclusive. I know that the word deceptive, I actually read an article by Caroline who unpacked some of the legal implications of using the word deceptive, because in the States, deceptive has a very, very specific definition. And as soon as you try and define terms legally, it becomes difficult because there's lots of words already used legally and you have a smaller space of choice. But I'm not a lawyer and I'm not really concerned with defining things legally. So I'm very happy to use the word deceptive patterns. And I think people in different legal jurisdictions will have to work it out for themselves, what term they use. That's my perspective. Thanks.
Totally. Well, thank goodness we have a legal scholar on this panel as well. I've also heard the term manipulative design used, but you know, Cristiana, would you like to weigh in, or do you have any thoughts also on how what's best to describe this sort of emergent area of harm? We call it manipulative design, confusing design, deceptive design, and even what are the issues of determining like what is or isn't a deceptive design pattern in this space?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I like the definition from the DSA. Actually, the first time where dark patterns have been codified into law. So I would go with the definition of practices that materially distort, impair, so a set of gradative practices, coerce, manipulate, deceive. And here is the big part that is mostly important for me, either on purpose, either on effect. So we see that the intentionality is not all the focus. And such practices entail the ability of users to make autonomous, informed choices or decisions regarding their purchases, regarding their time, regarding the disclosure of privacy of personal data, and sometimes very sensitive data. And these practices might entail harm or the risk of harm. So I think these constitutive elements are important here. And then we can discuss whether harm is truly an essential requirement, which I think it is important, but other scholars might understand it differently, because there are practices that do not entail the same harm. Regarding deceptiveness, there are practices that can be considered as dark patterns but are not deceptive, like nagging or confirmed shaming. So I know there is a big discussion revolving the nomenclature, but this is my take for now.
Thank you so much. Kat or Colin, would you also like to sort of weigh in perhaps your thoughts on the name, or even just what are some of the best ways to try to determine like what is or isn't a deceptive design pattern / dark pattern?
Yeah, just my quick take on this is that I think our industry has been trying to, rack our brains over this overarching term, which, I've used anti-patterns in the past. I don't necessarily think that's the perfect term either. But I think, what might help from a taxonomy point of view is actually just to be pretty specific about different strains of these annoying patterns, right? Some of them are deceptive, some of them are manipulative, some of them are coercive, or whatever the legal terms are. I think when we get pretty granular that way, then we can be more exacting in the kind of legislative means to tackle those different things. I think, when we struggle to find this overarching term, that opens up a lot of room for that kind of wishy-washy, oh, well, is it one or is it not one? But I think when we get more clear and pointed with how we label these various different patterns that we know are fundamentally problematic, then that I think might open up new ways to really, really target them when regulating or creating soft laws in companies and whatnot.
Thank you so much for that, Kat. That's really resonating with some things I've found emergent in my own work. And I think that that's actually a really great segue into a question for Colin. Colin, you think a lot about strands or groups of dark patterns. I know that that's some new work you have coming out on I guess we could argue a family or genesis level. Would you like to sort of talk about that work, if you wouldn't mind sharing it with the panel and the public of why are you even thinking about these sort of broader groups for things related to deceptive design and dark patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. So I resonate with all the comments from the panelists so far on the challenges of sort of finding this family resemblance and figuring out what to call it. I've done work with a PhD student to look at dark patterns as it sort of emerged on Twitter over the last decade. And we found that the squishiness of the term actually really helps to connect people, or is increasingly helping to connect people. And so, I think we can have conversations within certain niches about which term is better to sort of describe the phenomenon. Like Harry said, I'm not a lawyer either, but when you're talking in the legal domain, you do need to have that precision around terms. But I think there's still some connective power in the term dark patterns. I probably would never have met Cristiana or started writing with her if we had been using maybe some of these other terms. So finding the nomenclature that works for different pieces of the larger community we want to impact, I think is going to continue to be important. And this is what's driving a lot of the work me and my lab have done over the last year in particular, trying to connect the dots among like emerging scholarship, especially in HCI, but also in privacy and security and other related fields, and regulation, and trying to figure out, are there some family resemblances that we can talk about, and then figure out the levels of specificity that match sort of the situation. And so certainly having sort of high level patterns that I've described in my work, like nagging or forced action or obstruction, are useful, but they're very difficult to sort of articulate at the very lowest levels. And so partially through the legal consulting work that I've been doing, but also partially through building out sort of the start of a shared taxonomy or ontology of dark patterns, I think helps to articulate not only sort of the high level issues that are at play and why they're deceptive or obstructive or coercive, but also how they articulate down at the meso level and low level so that we can describe them in more detail. And we can sort of also anticipate other potential harms as they come downstream from new forms of technology or new forms of sort of data practices that we need to keep on top of.
Great, thank you so much for that. One of the things that I've been really excited about this panel on is that, and maybe I'm speaking slightly out of turn, but there's so many of us on this panel that have backgrounds in design and are collaborating with, let's say, like legal structures or law entities or regulators. Kat, you mentioned having spoken before the occasionally related to patterns. One of the things that I'm also curious about, because a few of us are bridging these multiple spaces of, let's say, like academia or research, policy, and then like the design world in a way, like for-profit, like design. Some of us are working designers or have been working designers. Options you've noticed from, let's say, like fellow designers out in the world or in the design world, particularly about combating harmful, manipulative, deceptive design patterns, and even trying to sort of engender, let's say, like more equitable design. Harry or Kat, do you have any thoughts? I realize I also just threw like quite a large question to the group.
Sure, I can go. I think part of your question might have cut out a bit for me. I don't know if it's my Wi-Fi or, but it was reflections about how designers regard like the combating of these patterns in their work.
Yeah, some of it's just, what are some of the misconceptions even about this space that you've sort of noticed having, let's say, working across the design world and like your current sort of research practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what I've seen is just that when we have all these different ways of addressing these patterns from different standpoints, right? Whether you're in academia or you're in policy making or you're in the industry, there are a lot of different, moments of like miscommunication or misconceptions that arise. And I think largely what we've seen is sometimes like these toolkits getting developed, frameworks getting developed to combat some of these patterns. As someone who has made a framework about ethical design and whatnot, and in reality, like in the industry, it's really hard to sometimes actually apply these various artifacts or toolkits, because even if designers in the industry care about it and they want to combat these patterns, at the end of the day, they have a manager to report to. They have certain obligations for their team, and their job could be on the line, which is very unfortunate and is an unfortunate, power structure there. And so I think that's something that I've noticed is that, we can develop all these toolkits and whatnot for designers to try to combat these patterns and to put their foot down. But I think ultimately what we do need is a regulatory aspect to really hone in on these companies that are encouraging the usage of these nefarious patterns. And also we need to, keep on encouraging the kind of organizing work that has been happening within the industry. People stepping their feet down and saying enough is enough, I'm not going to make this, which is easier said than done. And I think there's a lot of inspiration we can draw from other fields as well, where we have seen that kind of movement making. But yeah, it's certainly like, I think the biggest misconception is that just like of how easy it is as a designer to say no to some of these things. I think what we've seen is a lot of times more junior designers get asked to create things that are problematic, and whether or not they have room to say no is a bit nebulous.
Thank you so much for that. Harry, would you like to weigh in? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, product owners and designers and businesses, it seems, just don't seem to know what's already illegal anyway. Things like if you go and ask someone a peer in your design team, what about the UCPD or the GDPR, they'll just look at you blankly. They don't know about it, and they think that it's someone else's job, which is some of the stuff that Robin was talking about earlier in his talk. It's the responsibility for thinking about that stuff is punted out onto another team, legal team, and that way it all becomes very diffuse, and the caring about the minutiae of the design decisions tends not to happen because you think the legal team will care about it, and they think you will, and it kind of slips between the cracks. And then of course you've got DSA and DMA coming up, which sort of this can have an enormous effect on sort of the European tech landscape, and very few people know about them. It's kind of staggering. So I mean, if we already have laws that are being ignored and we've got new big laws coming along, what's going to change, and how can we make things change so they actually get paid attention to? And I think that ties into enforcement and big fines and big punchy outcomes, in my opinion. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Harry. I really appreciate that answer. Colin, Cristiana, would you like to add something at all?
I would like to build on Harry's point, and I think I will be then complemented by Colin for sure. There is already ongoing legislation tackling dark patterns. So from a data protection perspective, we have the GDPR and the data protection authorities with a lot of fines. So with my dear colleague, Mark Leiser, we are building a big study checking the enforcement cases, both from a consumer law perspective and from a data protection perspective. There are many cases. Maybe they are not that known, but there is a GDPR hub repository where all the decisions, at least on the GDPR level, are showing up, and many relate to dark patterns. I mean, we will provide some news in the near future, but there are already some enforcement cases regarding dark patterns. And from the GDPR perspective, they are around 150 cases. So maybe they are not being communicated to the public, but we will make some work on that bridge. But one thing regarding enforcement, only some cases actually refer to explicitly dark patterns, at least in Europe. I know in the US that reference to dark patterns is quite explicit, right? With these Epic Games, Credit Karma, etc. In Europe, only very indirectly. So there is this only indirect reference to dark patterns that might change in the future. And only regulatory decisions from data protection authorities do not use the amazing resources of empirical studies, user studies, measurement studies, surveys on dark patterns. There is a big gap between empirical works and the fact they are not being used in regulatory actions. It's really a big pity. There is also a big gap on user studies, studying users' reactions and perceptions and misconceptions of certain design choices and certain design parameters, right, that afterwards regulatory cases do not use. And there is also the other way around. Guidelines from data protection authorities and also from the European Data Protection Board are proposing best practices, also design parameters that actually afterwards are not being studied or tested actually by surveys, empirical studies and measurements. So there is this big mismatch. And also I know that different fields, computer science, law, social sciences, design are not communicating well yet. And I know that many studies are kind of scattered all around, but it's up to us to bring this research, empirical studies, surveys, etc., to the regulators themselves. So at the data protection level, there is this EDPB, so the European Data Protection pool of experts, and so we have the chance to communicate with regulators more closely. And this is a nice event that the ICO is bringing together practitioners, lawyers, designers to talk with each other. So this is one example for bridging the gap.
I just want to briefly build on what Cristiana said, because I think Cristiana really nicely articulated the complexity sort of from the academic side and the regulatory side, and that we're trying to build some of these feedback loops and means of communication. I think on the designers front, it's also really challenging, but I think there's a lot more hope than there was even 5 years ago because of these regulatory frameworks that are starting to come into force. And so, I'll echo the kinds of work that Kat has been doing in building out these toolkits to help people be more ethically aware in their sort of everyday design activities. And that's certainly something that my lab has sought to support as well. But I think what probably needs to come next is to more fully explore, like, what is the role of the designer in these modern organizations? Do they need to be regulatory experts? Or how do they sort of engage with regulation? How can they sort of think about legal exposure as a means of negotiating better design outcomes for users? And how can the internal user research that's maybe already happening with organizations be a driver for more ethically impactful design work rather than a means of actually like trying to hide in some of the worst of these deceptive patterns?
Got it. Thank you so much, Colin, for that, and Cristiana. And I think building on that, Cristiana, I love all the different papers you've written, and there's one in particular I'm thinking about. You've done multiple papers on cookie banners, because cookie banners and email unsubscribe are sometimes the two things I sort of reach for as examples when I'm describing dark patterns / deceptive design patterns. One of your papers found that out of 400 cookie banners you analyzed with your co-researchers, 89% were violating laws. I was wondering if you could unpack how some of those were in violation for our audience.
So I think you referred to the paper Cookie Banners, What's the Purpose, right? So this paper was written together with Ariane Rossi and her team in Luxembourg, she's leading a project on dark patterns specifically. And so we decided to research upon how purposes for processing personal data are expressed, because purposes are very important, right? Users need to understand why their data is being collected and shared with whom. And also the European Data Protection Guidelines of Transparency state that users should have obtained a clear overview of the purposes at the first glance and should not seek for the purposes for processing data. And they should also read them at the first layer of a consent request. So we studied all these banners, and we understood that around 89% of such consent requests that we see on a daily basis infringe the GDPR and the Privacy Directive. And so a bad thing, some banners do not even have purposes described, total absent, and this is really a big infringement. So not even disclosing any purpose is very complicated at the first glance at all. Then we also understood vague purposes. More than a half of the data set included vague purposes like user experience enhancement. Maybe designers would know better what this means. So there wasn't clear how cookies or other tracker technologies improve the user experience at all, whether certain cookies and other tracers were actually needed for the website to operate. So the language was also very ambiguous, using words like we may share information about the use of the site with third parties. We may use cookies. So these sort of indefinite qualifiers like might, someone, some parties, other data, possible. It's not at all lawful in the way to describe purposes whatsoever. Then we also understood that purposes are described using a combination of purposes like personalization and advertising, while purposes should be very specific and consent should be requested per purpose. So this conflation of purposes also violates the law. We also understood that purposes are written with technical language, not only with legalese, but really with technical language. What would be a user that understands what is retargeting cookies, for example, or Google Analytics? And the multiple ways in which measurement and statistics and analytics are described. And we also understood that positive and negative framing is widely used as well, which might steer the users towards consenting. And we also understood there is misleading language being used as well. So I think it's a delicious and short paper. And I think I would like to share with you. It's a very interesting way to understand how language could actually impact users' decision making. So it was a joint effort with a legal person, with other designers, and so thanks to Ariana's team.
Thank you so much for that, Cristiana. I think this is a good segue into a combined question from the audience and one of my questions, which is, as you sort of pointed out, like language can add this ambiguity, as well as in a way we can think of perhaps like the harm and sort of overly positive or overly ambiguous like language prompts inside of design as a form, let's say, of like we could say harmful nudging. I'm wondering for the panel, sort of with that in mind, like, are there other examples that come to mind of, let's say, deliberate or inadvertent or perhaps like unintentional patterns? I think that at times like content strategy or copyright can fall into that, as you have discovered in your paper with cookie banners, Cristiana. But for the panel, are there other examples that come to mind for you of, one could argue, less deliberate deceptive design patterns?
I mean, Colin's lab website, the UXP2, has got so many different examples of different types of deceptive designs and manipulative tricks. And I've got a big list of them on my site that I was talking about earlier as well. Were you suggesting we talk about some of them outside of the privacy space there, Caroline? Was that what you meant? Or?
It can be outside the privacy space for sure. I mean, what comes to mind for me in particular is I think sometimes people forget that language, like in design, right? So like the content that's written is an element of deceptive design patterns, as Cristiana pointed out. But I'm also curious if there are like other elements that y'all have noticed, or even particular examples. Harry, perhaps from the Twitter account of shame, if you will.
You know, I really like the term consent washing, which Christopher Wiley wrote about in his book Mindfuck, about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. I'm not really a privacy person. I'm sure everyone else, including the audience, knows more about privacy than me, but it's one of the things that kind of really brought it into focus for me, how to think about deceptive design and consent. So, I mean, it's the act of using deceptive design to trick users into clicking things that companies believe give them permission to do stuff like collect, process, share, sell personal data. And they think it gives them legal permission because they think it's consent. But consent washing involves it not being real consent. It's a bit like, you know, if you were to trip over and hit a button with your head as you fell over, does that count as pressing it intentionally? No, it doesn't. And the same thing as if you happen to click one of the interfaces, agree on one of the interfaces that Cristiana was talking about earlier in her paper, that really cannot be construed as consent. And in fact, GDPR and various other laws like CPRA try to carve that out very clearly.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. The consent washing really reminds me of the privacy zuckering term that you came up with. And for the audience, that's when you're tricked into giving more information about yourself than you meant to.
So I didn't make up the term privacy zuckering.
Okay,
just saying that just in case
Mark
Zuckerberg is watching and has decided he doesn't like me anymore. But yeah, so I mean, that's the idea that when you're signing up for a social media site and you go through the steps and you're lulled into this sort of sense of clicking next, and suddenly something comes up that involves you agreeing to, I don't know, say upload your phone book from your phone, all your contacts, or to contact all the people in your phone book. And that sort of thing that can end up building the social network is very advantageous to the people running the social network, but does things to your private data or even the private data of the people you know who are on your phone in a way that you didn't really expect or consent to. Yeah, that's one of them. There's about a dozen on my site. So the list on my site, deceptive.design, is a bit older. And then Colin's his website, I think it's called, can you remind me what the URL is called, Colin? It's OXP2 Labs or something. Has a more recent, more updated taxonomy. Sorry, go ahead. I was hoping Colin would tell us what his website was. I think
I mean, there are resources in a few different places. The probably most stable thing is darkpatterns.uxp2.com, which is the initial collection that our team built out in 2017, 2018. And I'll hopefully have information to share pretty soon about sort of an updated taxonomy that's bringing together the regulatory language and the language of a number of other scholars and Harry's work as well, to try to start to build this shared vocabulary. I think one other thing that's really useful in thinking about the context where dark patterns or deceptive design plays out is also thinking about the business models that sustain them. And certainly we see it with something like privacy zuckering, where one of the goals is just to build and extract as much data as possible. So it's this extractive model that is used by a lot of social media sites and others. And so sort of pairing sort of these broader issues with the specific design decisions that enable them, I think, is really important. Whether that's something like growth hacking, where we see these plugins on Spotify, which are now legal, I think, in the EU, that like Horify, that put a countdown timer on the site. I mean, just blatantly like, well, it's illegal, but it's also just really disturbing, the kinds of practices that are being used to try to extract a little bit more profit. Or we see this with surveillance capitalism as well, with the mass collection of location data or other forms of data. So I sort of like to think of this as coming from two ends. One is the very specific dark patterns, like the ones Harry's proposed and a lot of others have proposed. And then on the other side, we have to really look at business models or about frameworks like consumer protection or data protection that help us anticipate other harms that we might not even know are an issue yet.
And Colin, I'm really glad you brought that up, because going back to the question of like deliberate versus inadvertent patterns, I actually have a hard time thinking of the latter, because I think a lot of these patterns that we talk about fundamentally are motivated by some of these logics that Colin has addressed: surveillance capitalism, racial capitalism, etc. And it's for this kind of the growth mindset in companies. And so I think it's really hard to accidentally, like, whoopsie daisy, design a pattern that, you know, tries to get people to give extra data and give time, because I think there's always some level of intentionality behind that. And if anything, just going back to the original motivation of why do you want the users to click on this button so badly, or, you know, whatnot. So I think that's probably my take on it. It's really, I find it very challenging to think of a particular inadvertent pattern that's been deployed.
Yeah, just to throw one additional thing on top of that, there are some instances where I think some of these patterns have been sanitized and packaged in such a way that they look legitimate. And so, for instance, we found websites that essentially sell dark patterns, but labeled as just behavioral economics principles. And so it takes it one step away from something that looks like it's nefarious and makes it sound legitimate. And of course, you see these issues playing out with, like, are captology principles from FOG always wrong or always bad? And so I do think having a conversation about not only the sort of economic models that drive these kinds of practices, but also, you know, being more critical of how they're being labeled is probably going to be important.
100%. They're so normalized. They've been super normalized in institutions and companies.
Totally.
And I'd like also to add something here. We cannot also forget the role of developers as well, right? Especially regarding these code level dark patterns, wherein developers reuse certain templates or certain codes, right, from others. And so this happens at developer levels, but also at intermediary roles of consent management platforms. And so that presents a template, right, a user interface with some options that are include dark patterns by default, in which you only can reject to the purposes at the second level, or when you scroll really down through all the purposes. And so the roles of these templates and these codes, it's of extremely importance, because codes and templates are being used at scale and by default, without being questioned, without being corrected. And we cannot forget that consent management platforms are embedded in thousands of websites, at least in Europe. So if one template of one CMP includes dark patterns, obstructive dark patterns, false hierarchy, use of ambiguous and misleading language, how this escalates all around. So it's important to also kind of understand the role of intermediaries and CMPs here. That it's not only designers or not only developers, but an ecosystem of roles here at play.
Totally. Thank you so much for that, Cristiana. That was actually also a point I was going to make, where it's in a way like an entire, let's say, like design and technology team that also includes product managers, that includes design managers, that includes business analysts as well, right? Like it is really sort of like an industry-wide issue that sort of normalizes, right, these harmful patterns. I want to try to ask like two more questions. And one I wanted to ask to our panel is, do you have any advice for designers or engineers in the audience on how to, let's say, avoid deceptive design patterns / dark patterns? You know, for example, I'm sure a lot of our attendees are wondering, like, how can I convince my colleague that we shouldn't use deceptive design patterns in a current thing we're working on?
I mean, I'd say learn the principles of the laws, whether it's GDPR or any of the other UCPD or any of the others, because the principles are really quite straightforward. You know, basically, if you're nice to the consumer, if you're not an asshole to consumers, generally you're okay. So it's very easy to get a gauge on whether or not your design is okay. It's very easy to have a sense of the smell of it and think, oh, actually, it smells a bit wrong. To actually get into the details of exactly what you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, I would go and talk, basically have a relationship with your compliance officer or your legal officer. And it's some of the stuff that Robin was talking about earlier, to have more of an integrated sort of system between compliance, law, design, product and stuff. So yeah, but just learn some of the basic principles, like what it means to be fair and transparent and all the other things. And once you've got that, you will just have a sense, because generally these laws are trying to make things user-friendly, and designers want to make things user-friendly. So it's usually quite well meshed with what designers want anyway. It just gives you extra support to convince your boss or whoever it is to make sure you get to design things that help the people you're designing for.
Thank you so much. Colin or Kat, do you have any additions or thoughts?
I'll echo what Harry said. I mean, I think this is, it's an ecosystem that designers operate within, and I think the more designers sort of realize the power and impact that they have, and actually bridging some of these areas could be really substantial. I do think that like sniff test that designers often sort of engage in is also really useful, and it resonates with some of these high level sort of attributes or characteristics of dark patterns that have been proposed by Arnesh Mathur and others. So, Arnesh's approach is just to say, is it modifying the decision space in a way that's limiting choice? Is it manipulating the information flow? And those are some questions that I think, designers do want to design things that are usable, that make sense to users, and that give users an out. So you're not just forcing them down a path. And even engaging with some of those high level principles, I think could be really helpful alongside sort of the regulation issues that we've been describing as well.
Yeah, and I think just from a big picture level, I always go back to the organizing that's been happening, and I think it's super inspiring, and to kind of take courage from that and find people on your team that also maybe think that implementing a deceptive design pattern is not okay, and use that as leverage to speak up against that. I think that's really important, because this is our job. Our job is to create good, honest user experiences for people, and to try to stay true to that as much as possible.
Thank you so much for that. We have about 3 minutes left, so maybe lightning round. I'm going to choose a kind of hard one. Just like, let's see what happens. So one of the questions from the audience have been deceptive design often impacts globally. How can we address this when there's 160 plus data protection laws around the world? I guess panelists, do you have any thoughts on that? I know that that's quite a hefty question, but maybe we can lightly touch on it, or at least perhaps even sort of point to, I don't know, ways in which you would like to see that addressed. Cristiana, do you have any thoughts?
So I like this topic very much because of the not because of the lawfulness, which is already an intricate point, which are the practices that are actually considered unlawful or lawful. So case law will bring more certainty to this. But I think it's very important to analyze the harms caused by deceptive practices or dark patterns, because manipulative design will continue to proliferate, will continue to multiply, will be different UIs, different user experiences. And I think the methods of manipulation will continue to be insidious. When something will be prohibited, another practice will, of course, be born. So I think it's very important to measure harms from a GDPR language, measure the damages caused by dark patterns, and establish the thresholds in order for us to determine which are the practices that should be actually curtailed and preventing in terms of risk and in terms of damage. So I would check which are the ones that are the harmful practices for sure.
Thank you. I think we have about 30 seconds left. If anyone else would like to jump in really quickly.
I mean, I'd say it gets harder when, if a company wants to be as deceptive as possible in every jurisdiction, then it's going to have to spend loads of money building a different design for each jurisdiction to play it right up against the edge of the law. And that can be profitable, but it's also not a very nice thing to do. But you could, on the other hand, pick the strictest laws, whether it's GDPR or whatever, like evaluate all the laws, make sure you find one that's stricter than all the others and just comply with that. And in doing so, comply with everything else too, or do it in a principled way where you understand the underlying principles of the law and do it in a user-friendly manner where you care about what all the laws are trying to achieve, rather than playing it right up against the edge and looking for little loopholes, which is where it gets hard.
Thank you so much for that, Harry. And I think we are at time. I want to give a big round of applause to my panelists. It's been so delightful moderating for all of you. I feel like I have so many new ideas now. And thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Caroline. And my thanks also to all the panelists. Yeah, this is such an important topic. And we know that it's one that a lot of people inside tech teams struggle with, designers, product managers. How do we navigate this territory? So I hope that you found some new perspectives that maybe you can use yourselves, even to scrutinize your own work.